within our history in Australia and in our ancestry, it is all about being in this together. Not one person can, impact change. This is a collective change building force that we have to create amongst each other.
I'm joined this evening by Scott Wilson, who's a Gadiyungi person from the northwest of Western Australia. I've been working with Scott for the past 18 months, both professionally and personally. He is truly a remarkable man and incredibly compelling towards his passions and drive for social and systemic change for Aboriginal people. And in my passings with some of Scott's previous teachers and his principal, everyone has come back saying the same thing, that Scott Wilson will no doubt go on to be an absolute catalyst of change and empowering the lives of hundreds and thousands of young people. So, Scott Wilson, I appreciate it that you're up in the far north coast at the moment, or back at home. So thank you for joining us this evening.
Of course, thank you, Saxon, and thank you to everyone who is currently jumping on board to be a part of this journey today. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we are in this together. And as you spoke about, Saxon, about leadership, I feel like if within our history in Australia and in our ancestry, it is all about being in this together. Not one person can, impact change. This is a collective change building force that we have to create amongst each other. And so I'd like to start by saying, which is it's a good day here today in Broome, Western Australia. And I would like to acknowledge the Yaru people, the language of this country that I'm on today, and also extend that acknowledgement to Aboriginal people, past and present, and in all Aboriginal leaders emerging. And in the spirit of Yaru language, I'd like to share with you, which is Ngaji Gurujin, which is, well, they used to say Ngaji Gurujin Milia Nguda Garin, which is, how are you all? And you would respond to me by saying Gala Mabu. And I wish I could hear you all respond right now. But today is about reconciliation. It is about coming together in a safe space where everyone across Australia can have a chance to ask the questions. There is no wrong answers, no wrong question. I want to provide as much honesty with my whole integrity and ancestry to share that with you today. So please come on this journey and let's go through this with a spirit of reconciliation, which is we are in this together.
Scotty, firstly, Galamabu, back to you. I hope I've said it right. I know I've heard you do it 1,000 times at the Truth Project, and I always trip myself up on it. I guess the question which I want to ask you is something straight off the bat about breaking down a lot of these barriers that we've had previously. What's the best way of addressing, an Aboriginal person? Is it an Indigenous person? Is it a First Nations person? Is it an Aboriginal person? Give me your background and give me your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Saxon, and no doubt a lot of people across Australia all wonder what is the most appropriate way to acknowledge or speak about Aboriginal people. And for me, I'd like to just state that my perspective does not actually connect to everyone in Australia. This is from my experience, and I share this experience with you from my ancestry and my bloodline here in the Kimberley from the northwest of Western Australia. And at a very young age, I've had these kind of experiences around what do we call Aboriginal culture? What do we call or even address it and speak about it? And for me, for a very long time, I've always thought that Aboriginal and First Nations were up there in terms of what I would like to be recognized as. Indigenous, for a lot of people, actually comes from actually being connected to flora and fauna, which is a direct reflection of the systematic oppression that we were faced with for most of our history under Australia. So we are actually decolonizing by starting to recognize Indigenous people as Aboriginal people or First Nations people. And to share with you, when I'm in community and I go out to, for example, I was working with the Kimberley Land Council and I went out to Billaluna, and you'll hear this a lot of the time in regional areas, is that we actually don't actually talk about being Aboriginal. We actually start recognizing each other for the language groups and the connection to the land of which we are from. So if I go out there and they ask me, hey, boy, who your mob? And I'll say Guniandi. And when I say Guniandi, they know directly, oh, you're Maggie's grandson. I know your grandmother. And it is about connection. And so today, I'm actually going to be using a lot of words, buzzwords, that I want you all to recognize, because it will build the framework of what this whole conversation is going to be about. So these 5 words are simply context, connection, communication, culture, and community. Because all of those C's ultimately lead to making this our country better, the biggest C, our country living together and recognizing Aboriginal people as Aboriginal people or First Nations. And that's how I've always believed and connected with those terms more so than Indigenous. So thanks, Saxon. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, it makes complete sense. So for everyone listening, if you're speaking with a young Indigenous person, or sorry, a young Aboriginal person, to address them is the profound and the passionate and the correct way is to address them as an Aboriginal person. Am I picking that? Is that correct?
Yeah, I would also like to actually pose this out to everyone to actually reflect. And whenever you speak about the Aboriginal flag, do you guys say Indigenous flag when you speak about the Aboriginal flag, or do you say Aboriginal flag? You know, it is that point of connection. And for instance, if we only had cars, you know, I like to use this analogy in way of connecting to people, especially just to show you how we connect as Aboriginal people is all through that generational connection. And so let's just say you're out there right now and all we had was cars, and you had someone say, oh, hey, bro, what car do you have? And you say, oh, sorry, I have a Land Cruiser, you know? Oh, so you live out in regional areas. Sorry, I'm Ferrari. I live in the city. It's like, oh, I know a lot of people that drive Ferraris. And there you actually start the connection. So simply by using these things to connect is the foundation of how we connect as people through those language groups, through the land. And often we don't even say Aboriginal. We actually recognize the language groups that we have lived upon for 60,000 of years. Aboriginal in itself is a Latin term of ab origins, like of origins. And if we start to shift the cultural norm to actually being known by our language groups, I encourage you all to start thinking about what language groups are in your area, and start recognizing that. And say, hey, if you're in Sydney, say, hey, you from Gadigal country. For an Aboriginal person, that will directly connect you and say, hey, I know Gadigal people. Do you know these people? So by using these language groups, you got cut to the core in terms of understanding that relationship that needs to be rebuilt here in Australia.
You touched on a really interesting point there, and I think it's something, I really like the idea of your 5 C's, and I'll come back to it. But in terms of, acknowledgement of, we are one and in country, what's your perspective on the acknowledgement to country, which we see at major sporting events, we see it at presentations, we see it a lot of things. Do you think that it's something which Aboriginal people respect, and is it something that we can improve and get better at?
I think definitely in terms of that acknowledgement becoming more. I feel like sometimes we can get caught up with ticking the box and normalizing certain things when it needs to become more. So the acknowledgement started as a stepping stone to completely recognize Aboriginal land and language here in Australia. And it was a stepping stone that allowed the majority to be a part of. And for change to occur, it must shift from just the minority that are doing it to the majority. Because we live in this dominant culture that actually shapes the way in which we interact with each other. And once we start using things like acknowledgement to further that into self and individual acknowledgement from birth, like if you're from a specific area, I've said this last week or the other week in Careers Week, is that if you know the language group of which you were born, I encourage you to use that language group and say, hey, I was born on Gadigal, I was born on Wadja country, but I live in Perth. I was born on Yaru country, but I live in Broome. these acknowledgements are the stepping stone to getting everyone in on that conversation, to utilize and endorse Aboriginal culture. It's so beautiful, it's manifesting, but we can't normalize it. We must let it evolve into something that becomes so integrated into everyday life here in Australia that Aboriginal culture starts to be Australian culture. This is your identity, an identity that we all must endorse. And that's what I believe.
And so if someone was to be sitting here this evening and they work with a lot of Aboriginal young people and they're wanting to take this idea of change, what would be some of the first iterations or the first simple steps to begin to break down these stigmas and to be able to have these conversations? Because I know you've done a lot of work with a lot of young Indigenous men who are at risk of self-harm and substance abuse and a lot of self-hate. How do you suggest for our attendees this evening to be able to start those conversations and in not in a patronizing way, but in a really understanding way?
Oh, definitely, Saxon. I firstly want to acknowledge that for every community, it's going to be different, and that every language group is so unique, it is crazy. That one group in a community could be facing a high rates in this, but another group and the community won't be facing a high rate in that. So in answering this question, I like to break it down and bring it back to those C's that I mentioned before, which is firstly context. When you're going into actually even community or understanding the people, you must have the context around that socioeconomic background around that community, understanding it, but also showing that drive and determination to understand the history behind Aboriginal people, behind all of these things that are so much about contextualizing. Because once you know that, then you can fully understand the background is so holistic about all the factors that impacts a young person. And one of the points that I want to bring it back to is that a lot of things that impact young Aboriginal people are still similar to the thousands of Australians that still suffer under low socioeconomic disadvantage. So once you flip that back to not being just an Aboriginal issue, you start opening it up to it being a complete human issue. So context and understanding that context, firstly. Connection. I know when I say pick up and understand where you're from and actually speak language and actually say, I know this language group, that's where I was born. A lot of young people say, hey, I got family. Who are those people? That language group is connected to me. We start to actually form and build that relationship. Connection comes down to that building of relationship. Communication as well is key. And communication, there has been a lack of communication here in Australia. And to break that down, to break down the little silos that have been formed over generations of an oppressive system, it can be completely destroyed through greater communication. So that's not only communicating to the child, communicating to the parents. It is so holistic that it must be done holistically, in the sense that if you're speaking to the young person, you are investing time into his culture, into his family, into all these different things. There is no separation between all those things. That's what makes that individual. And to incorporate these things is exactly what we need to do. And it must be more than that. And so when it comes to communication, that also leads to community, right? Community, creating that sense of community. And this understanding that not only that, as a non-Indigenous person, you just want to do it because for the sake of doing it or to tick a box, but to show that endorsement of culture, that endorsement that you are there not to just be there and do a job, but because you're passionate about it. If you're there and show that passion and a love for why you're there, and that's the whole idea of year 13, is to make sure that you go into that position because you're passionate. That position is based on your understanding of your purpose, or that discovery and the journey into understanding your purpose. Because our students across Australia need people that are passionate, that are purpose-driven, that are there to impact the quality of the lives of our young people, not just Aboriginal students. So I hope that answers that.
Yeah, oh, mate, absolutely. And I think what was really interesting about hearing you speak then was that I was privileged enough to be doing a truth project with you once, at a school where there was some young Aboriginal men who were struggling to, and they, with school, and they were disengaging, and they were, the school wanted to keep them in, and they actually brought in a young fella, and they did a smoking ceremony. And by smoking, it was laying the leaves down and walking them through it. And it wasn't just young Aboriginal people who were involved with this. There were some other Indigenous from other countries who were brought in. And I think it's interesting that in terms of that context, the connection, the communication, and the community, and the impact it saw. Can you run me through, and probably for a lot of the people listening here, what is the cultural importance of having something like that, that smoking ceremony within the school, with what it actually was?
All right, so thanks. That's an absolute great question, and I feel like that's where we're leading to in terms of cultural integration of Aboriginal culture into all of our schools. The school that I was at, his name is Rhett Baraston, and actually goes and delivers these cultural programs across various schools. And a lot of schools that he actually works with have a low Indigenous population. Aboriginal percentage is little to none, or even schools that do not have Aboriginal people at all. And so what this does is actually gives an understanding that Aboriginal culture is for everyone to learn, to be a part of. Because I feel for a lot of the time is that we categorize and we distribute ownership in a big way. That on NAIDOC Week, we celebrate Aboriginal culture to commemorate, to acknowledge Aboriginal people, the First Nations people. Reconciliation Week, we do the exact same thing. But this comes down to a day-to-day healing process, a process of coming together, where doing things like that, like if you are at a school right now, if you're in the audience and you're at a school that has no Aboriginal people at your school, then I feel like you have so much responsibility and obligation to actually still understand the cultural side of Aboriginal people, but also still partake in all the events. Get in Aboriginal people to speak at the school, understand the history, do all those things. Because if you look at a lot of things currently in the media, like I guess Black Lives Matters and all these different things with deaths in custody, and look back at our history from 1972, Gough Whitlam talking about deaths and mortality rates for infants, there has been an illusion of progression. And the reason behind that siloed progression was because you're battling a 3% of the population against the majority. But what we need to start to realize is that the 3%, the majority is still being affected by the same thing that the minority are being affected by. We need to do a cultural shift where in Australia, it's not about if we have an Aboriginal student in our school, we're going to celebrate Aboriginal culture. No, we want Australia in itself, every school, every industry, every kind of environment to celebrate Aboriginal culture, to endorse it, to acknowledge it, and to partake in the spirit of it. It's so beautiful. And it's so, in terms of orally connecting, in terms of creating this identity. And once we shift that, it becomes less about Aboriginal people and more about the identity of Australia, the identity of this country. So for those that are and do work in schools without any Aboriginal people in there, I feel that you need to go out next week, either go out, send an email out today, and actually start talking about how can we start endorsing Aboriginal culture in our school. We can put up the paintings, yep, we can do all this, but this also recognizes that when an Aboriginal person comes to that school, a family signs a student up, they can see Aboriginal culture and feel like it's integrated into everything that we do and feel like they belong. And I feel that belonging is a huge factor for not just Aboriginal people. It is a huge factor facing all young people across Australia. Why can't we unite with a sense of identity built within our rich Aboriginal culture? If you look up in Arnhem Land, in a lot of places, the old people, the elders, they don't look at your skin color and say, nah, we're not going to teach you this stuff. They look at your spirit. They look for your love, your connection to the country, and they'll teach you, they'll share the stories with you. they will completely bring you into their community and share that with you. At a very young age, I saw that non-Aboriginal people speaking the language more than Aboriginal people. It is about understanding that identity and that identity that is ours here in Australia. It's not just Aboriginal.
Scotty, you touched on something there about progression, and you were talking about we need to be progressing as a nation, and this is, you know, from the Whitlam area when it was spoken about. What role do you think, you know, technology can play around digital literacy, around inclusion, around in bringing more Aboriginal culture to Australian culture and society, both in employment and education?
No, I feel like any which way, I feel like preservation is preservation. And you can see the evolution of Aboriginal culture across Australia, across the world. And technology, we've adapted for 60,000 years as Aboriginal people to use painting, to even introduce animals into our dreaming stories. Everything under our ancestry is continuous. That's why we call it the dreaming. It is continuous. There's no stopping it. We continue to evolve. It is moving forward, bringing the past back with us to understand our present. And so, in light of all of that, I feel like it is quite about that really understanding of how we can bring that forth. And I hope that answers that. Sorry, there was literally a plane that just went over here in Broome. We have a weird plane that completely distracted me.
No, all good. So we've got a few minutes to be able to run through, and I kind of want to summarize a lot of the people who have attended here. So in terms of tips and being able to build rapport with young people, it's about understanding, you know, the context, the connection, the communication, the community. What was the last C?
The last C was, did you put culture or context?
So I've got context, connection, communication, community,
and
creativity.
So context, connection, community, community, communication, and culture.
And culture, that's the last one. Culture.
Yeah, that's it.
Writing down my
So
notes.
all those things, yeah. It's quite, often when I speak is I try to make it as holistic as I can. And I feel that in our history, we've tend to divide or allocate things or put a bucket here, lump sum to actually impact on that, put a bucket here, when everything is so holistically connected that everything needs to be seen together. That won't exist without that. This won't exist without that. And we've tended to do the siloing of progression where we silo one area and we progress that side without actually progressing anywhere else. That is seen in our, I guess, Closing the Gap campaign, all these different things. And that's why I brought up 1972 Gulf Whitlam, is that it was the same conversation back then, and we're still having the same conversation today. And it's because we have yet to decolonize the system that has always, I guess, oppressed us. And it's a system that oppresses not just Aboriginal people, but all people.
Now, Scotty, I know that there's, and this is a great question, it's quite a loaded question, I'd love to get your opinion on it. How do we fix the disproportionate number of young people and young Aboriginal people in going into crime and going into the judicial system? How do we break this cycle of generational trauma, and what more can we do? I love the 5 C's, but what do you think? What can we do to break that generational trauma that has been experienced?
Well, that is quite a question that really we need to look at holistically. Like, there is no one answer to that question, and I feel like with my experience with the Stone generation, but also with a lot of experience here in my experience of Broome, and a lot of my classmates going into the incarceration rates that we see that are very high at the moment. But in terms of how to solve it, I feel as though it is a double-ended thing. I've always talked about it in 3 different ways. It must be done in a preventative way. with intervention. So at a very young age, we're looking at education system right now that is the same education that has equipped a lot of people in higher places right now, where we have a huge responsibility within education, our education department right now, to actually educate all Australians. Because one day we're going to have Australians in our schools right now that become the politicians, that become the policemen, that become all these different things, that it is such an obligation to understand where we can impact them at school, to direct them to better understand Aboriginal culture, to impact in that way. There is also a shift in our schooling and the context. I feel like adversity right now has evolved. Like for my parents, and when they were growing up, adversity was right in their face. For a lot of people, it is right in their face. But now it has changed. You know, a lot of people are actually kept in this illusion that these things aren't happening. And because it is in that bubble, that there are not much people, or there's only a small percentage rising above it to change that system. Much like civil rights movements, all these things where everything was in your face about rights, because there was such a lack of rights that it needed to change. But now I feel like there is only not this illusion being brought up saying that we've had the rights when we don't. This illusion that has continued to actually be this cloak over our eyes that allows us to really go our day-to-day life and realize, you know what? I don't need to make a change. I don't need to be empowered to do things. I can just live my life as an individual and do what I do. But in terms of incarceration rates, there has to be a huge reform in the way in which schools and way in which we educate our students. You know, currently the context of being in school, I feel like we just get told, oh, you need to go to school to get a job. You need to go to school to do this, when really it should be guided by the students. Like I would love to go back and talk to my primary school mates who went into jail and actually speak to them about what they wanted to do, the things that they were faced, that all holistically impacted on them. That's at home, being at home. That's the community, the environmental determinism that sets us up to fail. You change the environment, you change the literacy, the education, you change the context, you start to see change. And right now, we don't have the context. We just get told to do things. The environment is still evolving, but we're not conscious that it's actually impacting us. Right now, we're not even conscious that, you know, we normalize life in itself, like that this is normal. Like it's normal to, you know, live in a small town, maybe do drugs, do all these different things, see these things, see domestic violence. For me, I've seen that my whole life. So I normalize that thing as something that just happens. That's just life, when it shouldn't happen like that. There is so much we need to do within our schools, but then use the Aboriginal understanding of holistic living to connect to community, to connect to our homes. And that can only be done with consultation and with guidance by Aboriginal people. It's for us, with us. And I feel there it's so multidimensional that we need to stop to answer this question and to sum it up. It has always come down to communication. In my town right now is that we have so much people wanting to do stuff, but they're all siloed in their own organizations, not talking to each other. So the distribution of funding is going to all these different organizations trying to fix the same problem. No one's communicating. No one knows they should communicate, or people do think they should, but there is so much red tape, so much things that it causes them not to communicate. I've worked in prime minister and cabinet, and there are no visible walls, but there are walls that say that we can't go and speak to CDP while we're over here in the programs office. There are so much different things in place that silos the change when it comes down to simple communication. Young kids, they don't realize it's happening. They don't realize the impact of their decisions at a very young age because they haven't seen the context. My generation, I feel like we've seen our parents struggle. I've seen my grandmother struggle, the effects of stone generations and policies, and that has empowered me to make sure that I live a life that is nothing like that. That has been provided by my parents who didn't want a life like that for me. But we're losing that context. As we go on through life, we're going to completely step away from contextualizing why we do what we do. So that's why it's up to the schools as well to communicate with other schools about how we actually inform our students, especially Aboriginal students. The other day for Stolen Generation and Story Day, we had students that didn't even know what Stolen Generation was. Majority Aboriginal students that were asking, what is Stolen Generations? And in itself, that is a problem. And it can be changed if we just provide the context, deliver the information. Thank you.
I think you have articulated that beautifully, and I think that in running over time, and as we wrap this up, as you know, with all the work we do with Year 13, and I've built a lot of programs out with you that we run under the idea of, you know, to effectively help engage young people. We like to motivate, educate, resonate, and I think the biggest thing that I've taken from you here tonight is probably adding in a fourth step, and it's to communicate, and it's to be able to communicate the value of context, connection, communication, community, culture, so that collectively we can actually heal as a country and actually move into 2020 and beyond it, and make that the generation. Scotty, I can't tell you enough that I love you to death, and this has been an absolute privilege to be able to have you. I'm sure to the audience, they can feel the passion and the purpose and your vision behind it. So do you have one last piece of advice or some words of wisdom that you can deliver to me in 60 seconds?
Oh, yeah, definitely. When I spoke about the 5 C's, I really want you to take on, especially for a lot of people working to develop programs, that you guide your framework by those kind of understandings of connection, context, communication, community, and culture. Even if you're in schools out there that do not have Aboriginal people or students at your school, you are so important in the way we deliver change in Australia. If we get the majority, which is 97% of the population, to endorse Aboriginal culture, maybe we'll one day see an Aboriginal Prime Minister. Aboriginal culture is Australian culture, and for a lot of schools out there, especially with current things that are going on in media, we are educating the people of the future. You know, we have future politicians, future policemen, future whatever industry. We are educating them right now. And in the context of the future, they're going to be in positions where they will be at a point of impacting Aboriginal lives. They will be in positions that completely impact and affect Aboriginal people. What we do today will impact tomorrow. And so we are in this together. And without you, we can't move forward. And without us, we cannot fully connect to Australia. So
Scotty,
thank you.
I can't thank you enough for it, mate. And I'm getting inundated with questions, which we'll be able to field out in some emails afterwards. But once again, Scotty, thank you so much. Scott Wilson, the Goodiyandi person from the northwest of Australia. You're an absolute gem. Thank you very much for your participation in Reconciliation Week. I appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you, everybody, and have a great Reconciliation Week.